Those of you who aren't familiar with us, who might be joining us for the first time, we're a grassroots conservation organization that's based in East Glacier on the Blackfeet Reservation. We were founded in 1984 by Lou Bruno, who's joining us today, and many other community members, some of whom are still active, to fight oil and gas leases in the Badger-Two Medicine. And you'll hear a little bit of that story tonight and the updates on that work. We're dedicated to the protection, stewardship, and shared enjoyment of the ecologically and culturally irreplaceable wildlands of the Badger-Two Medicine and its interconnected ecosystems. We work predominantly, as I said, on conservation and management issues in the Badger-Two Medicine, but we also work sometimes on other landscapes, including surrounding the area, including Glacier National Park and the Flathead National Forest. And the Badger-Two Medicine, of course, is the cultural homeland of the Blackfeet Nation, and this larger area that we work on is part of the traditional territories of the Blackfeet, Kootenai, and Salish peoples. We're excited tonight to have Dr. Cristina Eisenberg share with us some of her work that she's been doing, including with some of the Blackfoot Confederacy around ecological and ecocultural restoration here in the crown of the continent. And to introduce her is none other than our vice president and one of our founders, Lou Bruno, who, as you'll learn tonight, is very instrumental in Cristina's journey. And I think many of us who are gathered here tonight can probably share similar stories of the way Lou has influenced us to care passionately and be just fascinated by the natural world around us, particularly when it comes to birds and wildlife. So I'm excited to have Lou introduce Cristina, and I'm just really grateful that you're all with us here this evening, and just excited to celebrate this glorious landscape with you this week. So Lou, I hand it over to you to introduce tonight's speaker.
Okay, you're too kind, Peter. I'm glad I have you buffaloed anyway, you know. So many of you that signed on, I can see who's watching us. Many of you are approaching, either approaching senior years or very in the midst of senior years. And as you know, the brain doesn't work exactly like it used to. And I can always use age as an excuse now for the fact that I've always been this way, you know, always been kind of flaky. And so I can credit my connection with Cristina to Facebook, actually, because it started with us somehow becoming friends on Facebook. And as many of you know, I've been involved. I feel like the alliances, one of the alliance's big mandates is education. And so Peter and I have been working very hard on a speakers platform and also winners from the Wildlife Film Festival, and many of you come to those presentations. So at any rate, so because Cristina and I were friends, Facebook friends, I kept seeing her posts on Facebook, and they basically describe her life, which is absolutely amazing and incredible. I mean, to see the things that she's done just blew me away. And so I thought, well, maybe she'd be a good speaker for our group as one of our monthly speakers, because a lot of what she does is with Native communities, indigenous communities. And so I called her up, and the first thing I said to her was, I'm sorry, but I can't remember how we met. I know we know each other, but I don't know if we ever met. Do you remember that, Cristina? I didn't know if we met in person. I didn't know. I had no idea. Then she informs me that in 1999 she took a Glacier Institute bird class that I was teaching. It happened to be my 3-day bird class, where I start on the west side, the middle day goes across the divide, and then the final day ends on the east side. And then she informed me about what she credits me with getting her interested in going on and developing her interest in wild things and wild lands and wild ecosystems. And in the meantime, since when she took this class, she was basically a stay-at-home mom. She was a naturalist in Glacier. She felt like she didn't know enough about birds, so her family gave her my class as a gift, as a Mother's Day gift or a birthday gift. I forget what she said. At any rate, since then, Cristina has gotten her BA, she's gotten her MA, she's now a doctorate. She's been all over the North America, all over the world, basically, uh, working to rehabilitate damaged ecosystems and restore ecosystems. And lately has done a lot of work just across the border in Waterton and also out east on the Fort Belknap reservation, I think. And so I'd like to introduce Cristina, and maybe she can remember better than I do about where she's gone since we first met. So Cristina, take it away.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. Okay, Nisto Anakok Mikstaki Kakatusaki. My Blackfoot name is Mountain Star Woman. For the last decade, I've been working very closely with the Kainai First Nation in Alberta and other tribes on traditional ecological knowledge and how to use the insights, the deep ancient insights that Indigenous people have, that we have, to restore ecosystems. My own background is I'm Raramuri and Western Apache. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. And I have some good stories to share with you. Okay. So, let's see. The Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance mission is to work to protect and steward the lands, water, and wildlife of the Badger-Two Medicine Glacier National Park and surrounding areas of Montana. And tonight, I'm going to be talking about food webs and the relationships within them and traditional ecological knowledge. What we refer to as Mitakuye Oyasin, all our relations, that's Lakota. So I'm going to take you on a journey into wildness, and it's my personal journey, but it's a journey that by sharing some of my personal journey, and Lou shared a really wonderful story. What I hope to do is inspire all of you to understand that if I could do this, anybody could do this, and that nature holds some very deep lessons for us, whatever our role is in conserving nature. I'll share with you some of my personal lessons. So the image on the top left, that's me a year after I took Lou's class, and I have my brand new Leica binoculars that was taken on Mother's Day. They were the same binoculars that Lou had. I remember asking him, Lou, what kind of binoculars should I get? Because I had some kind of crappy binoculars. And he said, well, these are the ones that I love. And my family surprised me with them. Below that, I'm working on my nature journal around that same time. And then wolves showed up in our backyard. I'm going to describe my backyard to you, but it's 2.7 million acres of federally protected wilderness, literally my backyard. And so shortly after that, I was crawling into wolf dens as a technician doing wolf den surveys. That was while I was working on my master's. Then I started a PhD studying wolf effects on ecosystems, and I'm going to talk about what I learned in that process. But there I am radio tracking wolves. I had collared wolves in Glacier National Park, and I'm radio tracking them to study the connection between wolves and elk and how aspen are growing and how that relationship affects things such as songbirds even. Moving forward, today I work out on the prairie in Fort Belknap quite a bit, and I continue my work with the Kainai First Nation and in Waterton Lakes National Park. And I found along my journey that yes, wolves are critically important to ecosystem health, but so are creatures like bison. And I'm going to share some of the science, the Western science, and how that links with the traditional ecological knowledge. So for context, I'm going to show you some maps. First, there's a crown of the continent ecosystem. It's over 10 million acres. It contains wild populations of all the wildlife observed by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1800, except for bison. But here's the thing, these species were not reintroduced. Some of them were locally extinct, but they returned on their own, such as wolves coming in from the north. So this ecosystem is considered one of the very most intact ecosystems in North America. Now my backyard. I live at the north end of the Swan Valley. We've lived there for 25 years. If I go out my door, I walk across my land and I have a handful of neighbors. Where I live, there's a higher density of grizzly bears than there is of people. And then I get to a strip of state forest, and then I get to the Jewel Basin Wilderness area, and then the Bob and the Great Bear and everything you see on the map. So living here and raising my kids here, I learned some powerful lessons about wildness and why it matters and why corridors matter and why it matters to keep large corridors of intact lands in order to sustain animals like grizzly bears and wolves and wolverines and lynx. And the Badger-Two medicine, the 130,000 acres, is in the heart of this. And it is a system in flux. It's a system that is in the process of gaining protection. It's critically important for many reasons, and I'll be talking more about that, as will Peter. So this is my office. This place has inspired the science that I do, inspired me to become a scientist. I've done extensive research in Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park and many other places in the world, but I'm going to focus on my work in this landscape tonight. So for some background, the Anthropocene, we have mobs of people coming to Glacier because they want to experience wildness. And they come from places like this. This is New York City. And this development began in the late 17th century. So this is the opposite of what the crown of the continent looks like. To get to where we are today, we took a lot of land from, well, all this land from Indigenous people who lived here. So that's referred to as settler colonialism. This is the official policy description of settler colonialism. It's the policy of a foreign polity seeking to extend or retain its authority over people or territories to develop or exploit them to benefit the colonizers. And this certainly fits what we've seen happen to the Blackfeet, for example, in some of their lands. And I'll be talking a bit more about that and what we're doing about it today. So this is what this looked like. That's a pile of buffalo skulls. These are photographs from the National Archives. Those are wolf pelts. These are images from the 1800s. And then there's the residential school children and the atrocities that happened as there was a federal attempt both in the US and Canada to kill the Indian and save the man, which meant assimilation. It didn't quite work. It did result in a lot of people losing their lives, but amazingly, we have retained the essential components of our indigenous cultures despite all this hardship. And here's how settler colonialism affected wildlife. So the map on the left, this is Liberté and Ripple's work, shows the ranges of 7 carnivores in 1804 based on the Lewis and Clark journals and other journals like the Thompson journals in Canada. Image on the right is what those ranges were in 2004. And I wrote a book about this called The Wolf's Tooth, and 2 books in the Carnivore Way. If I were to redraw the map, the 2004 map today, those ranges would come way down because there's a lot more carnivores in North America now, thanks to conservation efforts and legislation, protection from the ESA and the SARA, Species at Risk Act in Canada. This is what happened to bison. So the image on the left are the grasslands in the West, the Great Plains, and the Great Plains include the Foothills Parkland ecoregion, which is right up to Blackfeet lands and Blackfoot lands. Image on the right is from William Hornaday, 1889, and that shows bison range contractions. And you can see that by 1889, those bison ranges were these tiny areas in the heart of this, and the Badger-Two medicine is part of this. So how are we fixing all of this? Well, I sit on the board of the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is a global organization. And my role there is to lead the organization with regard to indigenous perspectives on restoring the earth using science and traditional knowledge. And so I'm a co-author of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. And these are the standards used by the United Nations, the IUCN, all the large global conservation science entities, to figure out how we repair the damage that was done. And so this second principle, I wrote that part of these standards, that in order to be effective, you don't just reintroduce an animal or reintroduce a certain type of plant. You have to draw deeply from the traditional knowledge of the local communities, and some of this knowledge is quite ancient. And you need to base your restoration activities, certainly, yes, on Western science, but also on this traditional knowledge. So what is TEK? Well, it's knowledge and practices passed from generation to generation. It's holistic. It's informed by strong cultural memories, recognition that everything is always changing. It's not static, and values. And I think this is the most important part, that include reciprocity. It's rooted in spirituality, culture, and language. It's a way of life. It contrasts sharply with the worldview, the settler colonialism worldview, who saw economics as the primary driver for taking over North America and for their relationship with nature. So this has to do with clear cuts and energy and mineral development, and the land grab that dispossessed Indigenous people, such as in the Black Hills, for example, and all the broken treaties, when land that was identified as containing valuable natural resources was taken. So Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It's essential reading, I think, for anybody who's living on this planet right now and grappling with climate change, for example. So sweetgrass, Heracloe hirta, is a grass that prefers moist, sunny sites. It's considered the hair of Mother Earth, so it's a holy grass, and it's braided for ceremony. And that's a picture of me with my field crew finding sweetgrass. It's at risk in the West. And we harvested some. This was last year. And the idea is that humans have, Indigenous people in the West, Western North America, have been picking sweetgrass forever as part of our ceremonies. And that it's meant to be picked. We have co-evolved this relationship with this grass as our teacher. And that's the traditional ecological knowledge piece. So if we pick it with respect, but we pick it in a healthy amount, it reciprocates by sprouting even more vigorously. So last year, we collected a very modest amount of sweetgrass, and there are two of my technicians, they're all Native American, braiding some sweetgrass. And in that picture, I'm helping my techs key sweetgrass, so go through a taxonomical key as well. So combining that Western science piece. And this is working on Fort Belknap on tribal land with funding I have from the Department of the Interior for ecological restoration of grasslands. This year we went back to that site and we found that the little population of sweetgrass we had found last year, which was like maybe 20 meters by 20 meters in size, a patch, is now 1 kilometer by 1/4 of a kilometer in size in a drought year. And it's pretty mind-blowing. We braided a bunch more sweetgrass. We collected quite a bit more, and we collected the seeds of it also for restoration. But it represents the intertwining of science, spirit, and story, according to Robin Wall Kimmerer. Old stories and new ones that will be medicine for our broken relationship with the earth, that allows us to imagine a different relationship in which people and land are good medicine for each other. So tonight, I invite you to think about what that relationship might be and how do we create that good medicine. And the Glacier Badger-Two Medicine Alliance is all about creating that good relationship and honoring these ancient relationships with the earth. So TEK and social justice go hand in hand because the values that are part of TEK involve sharing and restraint that are informed by spiritual beliefs. And Indigenous people, we don't just honor something like a wolf or a bison or sweetgrass. We consider those living things as superior to us. They're our teachers. They were here before we were, and how we learned to be humans and why we're able to sustain ourselves as people is because wolves taught us to hunt, for example. Grizzly bears, there's traditional stories, which I can't repeat because I'm not an elder in the communities whose stories these are. Grizzly bears taught us how to forage, how to find food in the wild. So the image on the left is an archival image from the Alberta Provincial Archives, and that are Blackfoot burning the prairie. So for many years, until very recently, the common knowledge in the Western science community is, hey, we don't have any direct evidence that indigenous people burned these grasslands. And this is the Foothills Parkland ecoregion. It's right up against the Continental Divide. Meanwhile, the elders would tell stories about we burned at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, and we burned the prairie, and that called in the bison, and then we were able to hunt them. And so I'm sorry, I was just looking out my window and I saw a wolf chasing a deer. My window is why my face is lit up. I'm looking east towards the Continental Divide. There's a whitetail that I saw running around like it was running from a predator, and behind it was a black wolf. Yeah. So this happens where I live quite often, and this is why I do the work that I do, from watching these relationships on my land. Anyway, the image on the right is, you see these patchy plant communities, and they were created from the burning and then the bison showing up to feed. And so the TEK practice of burning increases biodiversity, improves habitat for all kinds of species, and everything co-evolved, everything is linked in this system. And so TEK is acknowledgement of that tight coupling. It provides an interdisciplinary approach to wildlife conservation and management. So by acknowledging, the species in this image, they all have medicine bundles. In the Blackfoot Confederacy, there are medicine bundles for each of these species. There are also keystone species, which I'll be talking about. It's no accident that they're keystone species, and this is something that the Western science world just figured out in the last 10 or 15 years. So TEK provides deep, deep wisdom that Western science is only now starting to understand and come to those conclusions using Western scientific methods. So how can we heal the damage done to the earth? Well, by combining best Western science, traditional ecological knowledge, and social justice, because TEK is about respect. However, there's a chasm that we have to create a bridge across this chasm in order to do this. The image on the bottom is a GPS collared elk, and that's one of my graduate students. It's a PhD student on whose committee I serve, and I funded the collars that she put on these elk. And her study, it's in the Pacific Northwest, is about traditional foods and how the Native American people there understood the relationship between the foods the elk ate and how the elk fed. And that led them to populations of the foods that they needed to sustain themselves physically and culturally. So she's quantifying that with GPS collars on elk. That's an example. She's Native American, but it's very possible to bridge that chasm. It just takes respect, mutual respect, and Western scientists coming into their research, not assuming that they know everything, but rather assuming that we know very little. And that is how I approached my research, always assuming that I knew very little and that I was there to learn from the landscape and from the animals and plants in that landscape. So you see the characteristics, the qualities of TEK versus Western science, and you see they're opposite from each other. You know, qualitative versus quantitative, long duration versus short duration. The average Western science funding, like from the National Science Foundation, is 2.5 years of funding. TEK, it goes on for a lifetime if Native people who were studying something. It's not this finite, you go in there for 2 years and then you're done and you found the meaning of life, right? It's matriarchal TEK versus patriarchal. It's a community approach, TEK, versus Western science is an outside expert, comes into an area, studies it really intensively, very empirically for a short period of time and comes up with the answers. TEK is part of daily life. Western science is based on, Cartesian dualism and Aristotelian hypothesis testing. So it's kind of this imposed structure on nature that doesn't quite fit. So my background, after I got my PhD at Oregon State University and I did a couple postdocs, I worked at Earthwatch Institute at Harvard University as the chief scientist for 5 years. And my job there was I had oversight on 50 research projects, scientific research projects that took place on 6 continents. Many of them involved indigenous people, like some of these images, Africa working with lions and zebra and the food web relationships between them. The Amazon, that's a trail cam for jaguars in an area where the Kokama Indians are working to conserve jaguars. In Mongolia, a wolf and Argali sheep project. They are all led by indigenous people using TEK. So my experience with TEK, well, by working at Earthwatch, what I learned is that I just commented that I saw this deer running, on high alert, its tail up, its head up, running really fast, and behind it was a wolf. Well, the relationships I've observed here and their grounding in TEK, it's the same all over the world. Yes, each indigenous community has their own culture and their own way of living on the earth, but the unifying theme is that we consider the natural world our teacher. We consider these animals, like in Mongolia, the Mongolian herdsmen there, they shared with me that they learned to hunt by watching the wolves hunt, because Argali sheep are really fast and really hard to hunt, and so are the antelope there. And so they watched the strategies that the wolves were using, and then they mimicked them, and they started succeeding in their hunt. So that's an example. I have lots of stories, but I'm going to move along so that I can tie all of this more to here, the crown of the continent. So I'm going to talk about the research that I did in Glacier National Park and Waterton Lakes National Park for my doctorate. And what happened was Lou taught me about birds a bit. And right after I met Lou, in the early 2000s, wolves returned to our land after having been gone for about 80 years. My daughters and I were gardening and we saw a deer run by, and behind it were a pair of wolves, and they weren't supposed to be there. So I reported it to US Fish and Wildlife, and Tom Meyer, who was based out of Kalispell then and was the second in charge of the wolf project for the United States, he asked me to track them for him. So I did. And so one of the things I saw that happened on our land is that certain species of birds came back that had not been present before. Before wolves returned, the deer and elk would stand around like lawn ornaments, fearlessly eating. They would mow down. We had this big meadow on our land. It was caused because those animals had become, quote, dewilded. So wolves came back all of a sudden. The deer and the elk had to be on high alert or they'd get eaten. So they would take a few bites, look up on really alert, and then take a few steps and then take a couple more bites. And what that created was a patchy landscape, and the trees and shrubs, became in a very short while grew into this lush thicket. And my daughters and I saw American redstarts, and that is a species of concern that Lou taught me about. It only nests and feeds in that mid-story, the low canopy of a forest. Well, if you don't have wolves around and the ungulates are mowing everything down, you're not going to get American redstarts. So that is essentially what I studied for my PhD, but I studied it in 2 national parks, which was a much more controlled environment than my backyard. So a keystone species, I wrote a book about it, and that was based on my master's thesis. Keystone species they can be carnivores, they can be herbivores. They're a species that has a large impact on the whole food web. So their presence has the capacity to create a very healthy food web where energy is flowing through it vigorously. And if you remove them, then the system becomes a lot simpler. So that's a sea star in the bottom left-hand corner. And there's many stories about the effects of sea otters, for example, or bison or wolves on whole ecosystems. And a trophic cascade involves carnivores. So it's a relationship when an apex predator, such as the wolves that return to our land, affect the abundance and behavior of its herbivore prey. And the ideas that were put forth by Bob Payne around the early 1980s was that he created the term keystone species, and he was also one of my mentors. He's passed since then. But when you remove the keystone species, the keystone arches and ecosystems fall apart. There's 2 types of trophic cascades, mortality-driven ones and fear-driven ones. One image is a trail camera shot from one of my Canadian colleagues, and that is an elk successfully fending off a wolf. So wolves only succeed in their hunting attempts maybe 10% of the time. The image on the left is from St. Mary, from one of my study sites. So what happened there was that this pack of wolves was chasing this young elk. He's a yearling, a spike bull, actually chasing him on the main road into the park. This is in the winter when that road is closed. And the elk was doing fine because nature made elk just a little bit faster than wolves, but it was a whole pack of wolves chasing him. And, young animals don't have a lot of experience, so they can make foolish choices. This particular elk was doing great, and then all of a sudden he had the boneheaded idea of like, well, maybe I'll run down the steep embankment onto St. Mary Lake and to get away from those wolves, and the lake is frozen, right? Well, yes, but the frozen lake is quite slippery, and he slipped and the pack was on him. So that's the ecology of fear. That's how it works. It's the risk of predation. And savvy, more mature animals are quite good at avoiding getting preyed on by a wolf. So here is some food web theory for you. You have predators, herbivores, plants, and energy. And predators control herbivores and control both how herbivores feed and their density as well. And that in turn affects the plant community, it affects its diversity and its structure. And that in turn causes energy to flow more vigorously through an ecosystem. So think about that American redstart showing up on our land. That wasn't present before. Conversely, however, the bottom-up view of the world is that energy runs everything. And so energy from the soil causes plants to grow, that feeds the herbivores, and that in turn feeds the predators. So if you didn't have that energy, you wouldn't have a predator. And when you throw something like fire into this mix, that just really stirs things up. So here's my study site, Glacier and Waterton, and it's the Elk Winter Range and those 2 parks. So all the sites have similar climate, soils, and plant communities. They're grasslands with aspen patches. And then the trophic cascade model I used is that aspen, the bottom up view is that aspen support elk and that supports wolves, but conversely the wolves keep the elk on the move, and that's one of my GPS collared elk and a collared wolf that I had. And then that in turn affects how aspen grow. The environment, whether it's a drought year, whether it's a wet year, and disturbance such as fire provide bottom-up effects. And then the bison put in that system also. I did not study bison for my PhD, but it also affects this flow of energy. So this is the study site, what it looks like. It's grasslands dotted with shrubs and aspen. Oh, and those little things you saw that look like ants, those are elk. I looked at sites that had 3 different wolf densities. So St. Mary had very, very low wolves and did not have a breeding pair while I was working there. Waterton had a moderate density of wolves, and the North Fork had a very high density of wolves. And in the North Fork, I also looked at sites that had burned. The other areas had no burned aspen patches that at the time that I did my doctoral work. I looked at risk of predation and measured it. These are images from my study. The downed elk is from the North Fork. The wolf on the carcass is also from the North Fork. That's an alpha female wolf on a carcass of an elk in a very dense patch of aspen and conifers. And the bottom image is from Waterton, and we're putting in track transects to measure predation risk. Here's what I found. So these 2 images, the one on the left was taken at a wolf den in the North Fork that had not burned since maybe 1850. And the image on the right is also in the North Fork near a different wolf den that had burned. And so what I was looking for was, are the aspen growing into the canopy? And the elk, even at a wolf den, are eating those aspen and suppressing them in the absence of fire. And this is in the North Fork. This is in this crown of the continent ecosystem. These relationships are different than the ones in Yellowstone, which has 1/3 the amount of precipitation that we get here. So this is a trophic cascade, that recruitment. So what I published several journal articles based on this work, and if anybody wants to learn more about them, you can email me. I'll provide my email at the end of my talk. But I looked at elk response to predation risk and found it was influenced by multiple factors such as wolf density, that was the main one, and presence of fire. To understand the elk response to the wolf population, you need to also understand the rest of the context, and that's the TEK piece. And that fire, I found, was crucially important in working together with wolves to drive a trophic cascade. So then for my postdoc, Waterton Lakes National Park started setting these really large prescribed burns in my study site, and to mimic indigenous people's burning of that prairie. They were large fires, but they were low severity. Severity simply means how much plant tissue is killed by the fire. And they wanted to reduce managers the extent of aspen cover and restore the prairie because the aspen had been taking over the prairie there. And there were, a healthy wolf population, a very large elk herd, like 1,000, 1,200 elk. That aspen, the fescue, we're taking over the fescue prairie, which is a critically important grassland. So the map is of my GPS collared elk. And what we found was that the elk were completely avoiding the burn site because of predation risk. Therefore, prescribed burning didn't reduce the size of the aspen parkland. Managers thought that maybe the elk would mow down all these aspen because burning makes them sprout more vigorously and elk eat aspen. But elk were avoiding the aspen, and also these prescribed fires did not cause non-native grasses to explode. That was what people were afraid of. And it created a healthier grassland actually. And the prescribed fires did not change the plant community composition at all, really. So the same dominant shrub species in the understory, same grasses. And so these fires were repeated. So I was able to look at these relationships over time. And then the Kina Wildfire, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, in 2017 burned my study site. And it is the most severe fire that has occurred in North America. It was uniform in its severity. So how uniform? Well, the image on the left, 98% of that prairie where I showed you that picture that had all the little, black dots that looked like ants that were elk, well, it burned like that. It burned so severely that in some places up to 1 meter of topsoil was consumed. However, 8 months later, this is what the prairie looked like, the wildflowers. So even a fire of that severity completely, the system just responded to it. And then the aspen went crazy. So that particular patch of aspen, that's one of my plots, had a density of aspen sprouts, one of the highest densities ever found in North America, 500,000 aspen sprouts per hectare. So the Kina Wildfire burned everything with mostly high severity, but did not cause non-native grasses to erupt at all. The grass composition was actually, the only difference in it was that it wiped out many of the non-native grasses, but the native grass stayed the same. Significantly altered the aspen stand structure, so it killed the canopy, the overstory trees, and caused intensive sprouting. And also we did a diet analysis of elk and bison in 2017 and found that elk and bison diets were almost identical, which was a big shock to us. We assumed that they would be different, but elk were not eating any aspen. And normally they do. And we think that has to do with all the predation risk caused by the fire. And that's a deeper conversation that I'd be happy to have with any of you who have questions about that. So, but the fire brought us some TEK gifts. So my field crew was mostly Blackfoot. And I mentioned that, okay, Lou, so they see that bar there. I did songbird point counts for 3 years in my study sites to look at how food web relationships involving wolves affected songbirds. So the park was really strict, both parks. They said I could only have my rebar exposed by about 1/2 meter, right? So where that red arrow is where the ground used to be. What you see below it is a meter of that pole where there used to be soil. So what this did was that it exposed that fire, the Kina Wildfire exposed Pleistocene bones. That skull on the bottom right is a bison antiquus, a species of bison that went extinct 10,000 years ago. Nearby it was the jawbone of a dire wolf. What this fire, and there you see the arrowhead, and that is a pile of bones on the left. And so these areas, there were indigenous people that were hunting these animals. That was really obvious from all of the archaeological evidence we found that the fire revealed. It was all buried. These are my study sites where I had transects and songbird point count stations. So it was really mind-blowing. And the Blackfoot elders and Blackfeet elders had been telling me stories about these relationships in my study site forever. And people in the Western science community were really skeptical because they said, well, gee, those are interesting stories, but there's no empirical evidence of this. So that fire revealed all of this. And this was published in a journal article that we wrote, and park managers were co-authors in that article. The missing piece is the bison. And so along came the INI initiative, and on the right is a timeline of it. So the INI means buffalo in Blackfoot, was initiated in 2009. And you can see the chronology. The Blackfeet herd were transferred from Elk Island, 87 animals. There was a reintroduction in Banff and one on Kina lands in 2020. And on the image on the bottom is of the INI celebration 2 years ago on the Blackfeet Reservation. And really celebrating our traditional life ways with these animals that nourished us in body, mind, and spirit. And with elders present, people like John Murray, Irvin Carlson, who hold such deep wisdom. There's been a lot of celebration. The Buffalo Treaty, I was in Banff when there was a signing ceremony for it. And at this point, I think there's 60 signatory tribes to that treaty. And then briefly, 2 years ago, I started working in Fort Belknap on a 5-year grant from the Department of the Interior to study TEK in the context of grassland restoration. And my field crew consists of almost all tribal members from Fort Belknap. And some of my Blackfoot technicians join us too. And that's the botanist for BLM for the Montana Dakotas region, Wendy Bellman. She's consulting Minerva Allen, who's an esteemed Nakota elder, about plants. And so the plants that we study in this project, they are the ones that we were directed to look at by the elders, and everything is done through the Tribal Historical Preservation Officer. And all the data collected on tribal land belongs to the tribe. So there's strict data sovereignty. So what's the other missing piece? Well, the Badger-2 medicine is crucial in restoring TK relationships and mending the web in the crown of the continent ecosystem and beyond. The image on the bottom right, it's from my book, The Carnivore Way. The arrow shows where the Badger-2 medicine is relative to that corridor that goes from Alaska to northern Mexico, which is where my ancestors are from. And you can see that maintaining these connected, healthy wild landscapes is crucial. Specifically, the Badger-2 medicine is a stronghold of Blackfeet values, traditional hunting and gathering ground, a vision quest site, an important headwater site, part of that vital corridor, also known as the Earth's backbone. In 1895, a strip of Blackfeet land was ceded to the federal government, and this was done in a way that was not transparent and has been challenged legally. In 1980, there were 47 oil and gas leases provided with no tribal consultation. And in 2020, the leases were retired after a whole lot of litigation and hard work. And now what's on the table is the Badger-2 Medicine Wilderness Act. And the debate about it gets pretty acrimonious. And in my perspective as a Native American scientist, and I've shared with you some of the lessons I've learned in my work, the Blackfeet are critical to this it is Blackfeet land, and Blackfeet TEK is essential to incorporate into how this land is managed and in any conversations about its protection. And that is social justice, but it's also about mending that web. So next questions for you and I and others to think about. So how do you incorporate trophic, which means food web relationships, into fire management in a warming world? You've heard about and experienced, some of you, the catastrophic fires we've had this last year, and that Kina Wildfire, I was actually evacuated from it with my field crew twice. So a wall of fire advancing toward us. So how do we deal with that? You know, what are the implications to management and to healthy ecosystems? How do we restore resilient, healthy wildlife habitat on mixed use Western lands? And the Badger-Two medicine is part of that debate. That image is from Alberta. It's too many elk. And you can see the condition those aspen are in an area that does not have much of a wolf population. And then how do we deal with dispersing carnivores? So this is an image. Doug Smith in Yellowstone is a friend and colleague. And I had a project for years in Colorado where wolves were dispersing. And this is one of his collared wolves. It ended up right in my study site in Colorado. And it was a female who was collared and had a mate and had dug a den. And then she was inadvertently killed by a rancher with poison he'd set out to bait coyotes. And the rancher was really upset because he actually happened to love wolves. So that story had a tragic ending. There's many more stories like that in the West. And there's also very positive stories of, wolves dispersing and other carnivores like wolverines and lynx dispersing and finding a good life. So how do we adapt to that? And with that, I want to thank Lou and Peter and the Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance, both of the parks that I've worked at here, Parks Canada, who funded quite a bit of my research, the Kainai First Nation, Earthwatch, the Whitefish Community Foundation, the Davin Family Fund, and the Chesonis Foundation, who have funded the Native American and First Nations youth who joined me in the field, provided really nice fellowships for them. And the government agencies with which I work in the Society of Ecological Restoration. And there is my email address. I invite you to please email me any questions that you may have that may pop up later on for you, or if you want copies of my journal articles or anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'll open it for questions. I'm going to turn more light on. Hang on, I'll get my other light. That's better.
Cristina, that was excellent. Thank you for walking us through a bit of your journey, and as well as the discoveries that you've had and the work that you're doing. It's really fascinating and important stuff. I'm waiting for Lou here to turn his camera back on because Lou's got the opportunity to ask the first question. And while Lou's getting ready to ask the first question, we've received one question so far in the Q&A, but please make sure that if you have others, you throw them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and I'll be sure to make sure that we get some of those questions to Cristina. So feel free to throw them in, and Lou, I'll turn it over to you. You might want to throw your video on here to go ahead and ask these.
I don't know how to turn my video on. I unmuted myself, but let's see. I don't.
Well,
I should be able to.
Oh, okay. Start my video. Okay.
there you go.
Okay, so Christina, I want to ask you, well, two questions. Um, you know, I have great um, hope based on some of the things you're telling us, but there are also some other things that loom, some obstacles that loom greatly that I'd like to be uh, positive about. One is the fact that we're talking about these ecosystems recovering, but we're up against things like climate change. I realize fire is a normal part of the ecosystem, but these are not normal conditions we've got. And so how do you stay positive when the situation just keeps getting worse? Old growth is getting less and less common. The water of the park has been logged and burned to the point where much of it is not forest anymore. How do you recover these ecosystems in the face of these odds, in the face of these conditions?
Well, ecosystems are a lot more resilient than we give them credit for. And that is one of my big lessons that I've had as an ecologist. And I keep getting that lesson over and over again. I hold on to hope because of people like you, Lou. And if you think about how things were when you founded your organization and how things are now in terms of populations of animals and plant populations and all the restoration that's happened, there's been enormous progress. And you and your organization have been a key participant in that. And all of the teaching that you've done in your life, Lou, teaching children in school and
I think we may have lost Christina's feed there. Hold on one second, everybody. Christina? Let's see if we can get her back. Otherwise, we'll bear with us. Thank you for being patient, everyone. Okay. Well, not sure if we're going to get Christina back here. Give her another moment.
Yep.
Oh, we'll see if she logs back on. Give her 1 second, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us. We have a couple other questions that have come in. Go ahead and throw your questions in the chat. We're waiting to see if Christina gets back on here. And if if for some reason we're unable to get her back on here, I'll make sure these questions are forwarded to her. We have a series of good ones in the chat. Let's give her another moment here. Okay, nothing from her. Tasha, if you can help. Okay, well, let's thank. I'll go ahead here and just say a few things while we wait for her to maybe get back on. I'll just let everyone else know we're gonna excited to give not only our great thanks to Christina, but also to offer her a beautiful one of these new hoodie sweatshirts we have here at Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance. I really was a little disappointed that we've lost her, but man, that was just great to hear the ways that science and traditional knowledge can work together to help us better understand these systems and to try to restore these systems. And in doing so, it's also a way of kind of restoring us as people to the places where we live, both the traditional cultures who've occupied these lands for since time immemorial, and those of us who've lived here for shorter periods of time. And as she was saying, you know, one of the things I find really hopeful with her work is the way that we're discovering just how important practices like burning and bison and the whole web of relationships are. And I'm hopeful that as that is discovered and heard more and learn more, that we'll have more people coming together behind efforts to help restore those processes. But as Lou was talking about, and Cristina acknowledged at the end, obviously those are very complicated to put a lot of those relationships back onto the landscape, both because of changes from climate change and development, as well as, of course, just the fact that these are mixed use lands now with different competing economic priorities that make some of this difficult. So Lou, to your question, I think, you know, I think that it can be hard at times, I know, to figure out how to put those pieces back, but I do think it's pretty amazing to look and see that, you know, look at the INEA initiative, for example, and what they're trying to accomplish with bison restoration, something that we've been supporters of, that, you know, you think where bison were in this country and the conversation around bison was, you know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the fact that we're now talking about not just here in Blackfeet country and greater Glacier region about where might we be able to have some possibly wild herds, but we're talking about that in other parts of the state of Montana and the country as well. So these conversations are slow in developing, but they are developing, and to me, I see them moving in ways that speak for restoring the landscape and restoring a lot of the web of life that lived here. And of course, they're slow conversations, they're complicated conversations, but I think we have some good examples of us moving that direction. Oh, great, Christina's here.
This is Cristina. I'm here.
Great.
I don't know what happened, and there's no option for me to start my camera so you can see me. So it's one of these weird glitches that just happened. I could hear what you were saying, so I don't know what happened. It's like a Zoom hiccup or something.
Yeah. Well, Cristina, if you want to add on anything about to Lou, and then I got several good questions I'd like to get to in the chat here.
Okay, that's better. That's better.
Oh,
Okay.
there you are.
Here I am. So I'm
like
sorry about that. I don't know what happened. It just kind of booted me out of as a panelist, and now thank you for letting me back in.
Of course.
So what I was saying to Lou, and I heard what you were saying, Peter, and that's right on. The problems we're facing right now are huge. And as humans, I believe that traditional ecological knowledge and the values that involve reciprocity and not seeing ourselves through that settler colonialist mode, where we're the rulers of the universe and everything on the planet is there to serve us or entertain us, such as wildlife viewing and such, but rather we see us as needing to serve the planet with humility. And that if we do that, then the planet gives back to us what we need. That's part of the solution. We need best Western science to give us the the sharp teeth, the tools to do this work. And all of my Indigenous colleagues around the world really recognize that. And many of us became scientists in order to have those tools at our disposal. But the Western science alone is not going to fix the problems that you described, Lou, and that you were talking about, Peter. So what we need is humility and reciprocity. And things are moving very fast right now. So I think that I'm not trying to get political, but we have a Secretary of the Interior who's an Indigenous person. And that gives us a very different set of eyes to look at our natural resources. So I'm hopeful, but we really have to make some big changes right now, or we have so much that we could lose.
Christina, it seems to me one of the things that TEK brings to these conversations is a certain value set and a certain orientation towards relationship to the world and close paying of attention to those relationships. And science gets at that through a different process, typically a more deductive process, but not always as such. That breaks things into sort of discrete parts and tries to understand those discrete parts. And I have a question here from Michaela. You know, as a lot of our land management agencies in particular are steeped both in the Western science and a lot of our policies are. I wonder if you could break down a little bit more from a management perspective, like how you might incorporate traditional knowledge into management of these landscapes and how those two, how you use those two bodies of knowledge to actually make decisions on the ground for real management problems.
Yeah, it has to do with co-management, and the experience that I'm having with managers right now in the national parks and on other federal lands like BLM lands is, for example, the BLM is their native plant conservation program. So they're keenly interested in, as an agency in general, in co-management, exploring co-management of natural resources with tribes. Now, what does that mean? That means just because there's a political boundary demarcating Glacier National Park or the US-Canada boundary, or where BLM lands and an Indian reservation begins, those boundaries don't mean anything to the animals and the plants and the pollinators, right? And so what agencies in Canada and in the US are coming to is that there needs to be management across boundaries, and management not just across political boundaries, but across cultural boundaries. What tribes bring to the table is, okay, the idea of wilderness. When I worked at Harvard at Earthwatch, I lived near Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. So it's steeped in Thoreau and Emerson's vision for wilderness and protected wilderness. And there's John Muir's vision too. But what scholars have found is that those visions are based on settler colonialism. They take humans out of nature and you put a wall around it and you protect it strictly. And that, it's like the sweetgrass story. They found that if sweetgrass isn't picked, it dies, the patch dies. So what tribes bring to the table is that we live by subsistence. That is our tradition. And so these are working lands. And I'll give you one quick example. The Fort Belknap Indian Reservation this summer was a stage Category 4 drought. On BLM lands, I was supposed to pick harvest seeds for restoration of critically important grass species. On BLM lands, there was nothing to pick because the drought created a situation where the grasses didn't make seeds. Some of them didn't make it taller than 4 inches high. On tribal land, I found massive amounts of seeds, like seed plant populations that extended for 10 miles that were, went up to my shoulders of grasses, prairie grasses. Now, you'd say, oh, well, that's because the BLM, has cattle on their lands. Well, guess what? I had trail cameras up and the tribe had cattle on their land too, but they managed them differently. They managed them based on reciprocity and TEK. And the plant communities, the soil, the elevation, the amount of precipitation, all the slope and aspect, all the environmental conditions were the same on BLM land versus tribal land. So why the stark difference? So BLM's attitude when I told them the managers what my findings were was, this is awesome, Cristina. This is a big lesson for us. We need to understand better what the Fort Belknap community is doing and how we can learn from them in practice co-management. Now, BLM also provided something along the lines of 20 jobs for tribal members with the funding that I have to do this work. So they're very strongly supporting that community. And this is not like extracting a colonialist approach to extracting their knowledge, but it's like a true collaboration with the federal government, really strongly supporting that community and hiring people like elders, for example, to advise us. So that's the co-management. That is a potential solution. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be mutual respect, like true respect. And there's still quite a lot of settler colonialism and racism in this nation, as you know, and not just with Native American people. I'm Latina as well. And you know, it's not such a good situation right now for many of us. But that is it, that's the frontier right there. And it really has to do with our philosophy as Indigenous people of how we relate to the natural world, and see it as, yes, it's there to sustain us, but we're supposed to sustain nature, and we are intrinsic to nature. We're embedded in nature, and we're not above nature. Nature is our teacher.
Great, thank you. Let's see if we have one other question here that I wanted to ask, which is from Regina, and she's a science teacher on the Blackfeet Reservation, and she wants to know if you have any recommendations for incorporating TEK, into the classroom, as well as advice to her Blackfeet students about pursuing their studies in science.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful question. And I work with so many tribal young people. In fact, my whole program, research program, is based on tribal youth. So start teaching them really young. So I have internships for starting like in 9th grade, let's say, students. Start with a story and then get into the layers of knowledge, including the Western science layers. An excellent resource is Roz Lapierre, who's a professor at the University of Montana, and she's a friend and a colleague of mine. I respect her tremendously, and she's done a lot of work on this, on how to get young people, how to teach young people how to work with TEK and Western science, and how to empower Indigenous youth. But I believe that Indigenous youth are the answer, really. You know, I think that they are going to be leading the charge with this. And I've already seen many of the Indigenous youth who have worked for me as interns and technicians are now leaders, like as in serving on the tribal council and going to graduate school and getting graduate degrees. If you want, you can email me to discuss this further. I'd be happy, you know, to chat about this more.
Well, Cristina, thank you so much for being with us. Lou, before we wrap up with Cristina, is there any other questions that you had for her? Otherwise, we're approaching our time here.
No, I think I'll talk to her later about it.
Yeah. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for sharing with us both your research and highlighting the role and importance of restoring these relationships, of thinking about the values of TEK and Western science and how they can inform each other, as well as highlighting the importance of places like the Badger-Two medicine to kind of maintaining and restoring the health of the whole larger landscape that stretches what is up today up into Canada, down south towards what's today Yellowstone and beyond. So we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today virtually, and look forward to getting to meet you in person. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but we will be would like to send you a sweatshirt.
Oh, I would love that.
I know that you work a lot in the field, and so it'll keep you cozy and warm. We have several colors, and we can connect about that.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you for the amazing work that all of you are doing. It's critically important, and you're building those relationships. So thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Lou, for your mentorship and inspiration, which has stuck with me all these years. And I look forward to connecting in person and preferably in the field with all of you. So after this virus subsides a bit, hopefully we'll be able to have some time afield together. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Give your own round of applause to Cristina, wherever you may be.